All right. Once again, I am joined by an alumni of the wonderful Johns Hopkins University, Dimitri Sims, who is a reporter, freelance reporter based in Moscow right now. Hi, Dimitri. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite fine, thank you.
Best way to be doing. So we talked a lot about uh, the culture in Russia. We talked a lot about the international relationships that Russia has with other countries. But now I want to focus in on what's going on within Russia. So I'll tell you as much as I know. There's Putin, and there's the oligarchs, and then there's the Duma. And effectively, whatever Putin wants happens within Russia, but the oligarchs play a role and the Duma is there to kind of craft specifics on policy. What exactly did I miss there? What did I get wrong?
Well, I would say that, in many ways, Russia is a very centralized political system. It's right, you know, I don't think it would be a surprise for anyone. You don't need to be a Russia specialist to, basically guess correctly that Vladimir Putin plays a far more central role in the Russian system than, Trump or plays in the American system, or Theresa May does in the British system, Macron in the French system, so on and so forth. Um, what I would say is that there one thing that I want to kind of emphasize about the sort of economic elites, the oligarchs. My impression is that, well, I think I want to go back. I think it's kind of interesting to trace the sort of origins of the oligarchs, because the oligarchs emerged in the 1990s. And I think one of the problems that we have when we talk about Russia is that we kind of, we stop at Putin, because Putin has been around for so long that we kind of, use that as our frame of reference. But if you look about it, in some ways, Putin is a is a transformative leader. In some ways, he is the one who started a lot of the things that we currently see in modern day Russia. But in many ways, he's kind of continuing certain aspects of President Boris Yeltsin, his predecessor, the first post-Soviet leader of Russia. And there's two things I kind of want to emphasize on that. First of all, there's been a lot of commentary about how, in Russia, there's this super powerful executive branch, and, the legislative branch really doesn't have the ability to push back in the same way that it does in the United States. That began all the way in 1993, because back then, Boris Yeltsin, he wanted to have, rapid market reforms, because Russia was a communist country. He wanted to move it quickly to a capitalist country. The problem was that the people in parliament, they weren't ready for such radical changes quickly. They wanted more gradual reforms. They said that if you blow up the system completely, you're going to, destroy a lot of people's livelihoods. In the process, you're going to destabilize the situation in the country. And they also didn't like the fact that Yeltsin seemed to not really be interested in consulting with them on how to go about economic policy. He was someone who he was really much of the mindset, my way or the highway. And that led to a confrontation in 1993, where basically Yeltsin dismissed the parliament, parliament impeached him, and there was basically a confrontation that ended with Yeltsin sending tanks on the Russian parliament and, calling for new elections and instituting a new constitution. And under that constitution, you see power considerably, strengthened in the Russian executive branch. And although obviously, like under Putin, I think it's fair to say that political freedoms have been limited, far more than under Yeltsin. But I think it's important to understand that this is sort of an ongoing process, that Russian democracy really never had a chance to fully develop, that it's something that was, if you will, killed in the cradle. Because you really didn't have a chance for a sort of genuinely strong legislature to develop that could balance an executive branch. And although in the 1990s, people in parliament had more ability to push back against the Russian presidency, and they had greater ability to, publicly oppose it than they do now. All the same, after 1993, you really see Russian democracy kind of go into a decline. When it comes to the oligarchs, that also is something that started back in the 1990s, because former communist country, you had all these sort of massive state-controlled industries that needed to be somehow divided up. And so there's a sort of, there could have potentially been a fair way of privatizing it all, giving it from, the government to, ordinary people. But that's not how it ended up happening. The way that it ended up happening is that the people who got, these sort of former state companies, former state assets, were people who are well-connected business people. And so that's how you got the oligarch class. And the oligarch class, with its massive financial resources, with its massive control over the media, were able to help Boris Yeltsin win a second term, despite the fact that he had single-digit approval ratings.
Whoa. Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so Russian oligarchs kind of in Yeltsin's second term, because in addition to being very unpopular, Yeltsin had a lot of health problems. So for about a year or so, he was basically not able to run the country because of his health issues. And in that time, there was a group of 7 bankers who were kind of, jostling among themselves to try and make political decisions in the country. And for a year or so, Russia was genuinely an oligarchy. But since then, the presidency kind of reasserted its control. There's a major financial crisis in 1998 that eliminated a lot of these oligarchs. And then when Putin came to power, one of the sort of, defining things he did was he kind of subordinated the oligarchs to the control of the state. So the oligarchs still had a lot of financial power, but they no longer had the sort of political influence that they once did. So I think there's sort of this perception in the United States that there's oligarchs who have leverage to pull the strings. I think that well-connected oligarchs, they have oligarchs with friends in powerful places. They can make phone calls and ask for favors and, generally get their way, but they can't, dictate Russian politics like they once were able to for that brief period, like from 1996 to 1997.
Okay, so it's a little bit more free flowing. It's not really, there's not really a set of rules for the oligarchs necessarily, but there's also no safety nets for them.
What I would say is this, that clearly it's very good to be rich in Russia.
Pretty good to be rich pretty much anywhere. So,
but I mean, like, I would definitely say there are, a lot of privileges that come with being in Russia's wealthiest elite. But I don't think that, based on what I've been able to read, what I've, studied, it's not like it was in the 1990s, or even not even for the entire 1990s, for a period in the 1990s when a small group of business people were literally influencing policy decisions. That's not the case anymore, where, the will of the business people is, the government's will.
Okay.
I think it's far more accurate to describe Russia as a sort of political state where there's a very strong centralized federal government, which has a friendly relationship very cozy relationship with big business.
Interesting. Okay, so it's almost like a crony capitalist. Would you describe it that way?
I think there's a lot of experts that would describe it that way.
Okay. Would you say that that for the oligarchs, is it always the same few people, or is it kind of a rotating door of like different people through different
Well,
circumstances?
during the 1990s, there were some oligarchs that rose to the top, but then, under Putin, they lost their fortunes. There was the very powerful Boris Berezovsky, who was, as close to power as you could get. But he ended up losing out on his fortunes after clashing with Putin. There's the famous case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was a major oligarch, but then, he clashed with Putin politically and he ended up losing his fortunes. I think there's a very clear narrative. You look at sort of history of these sort of oligarchs, that the sort of business people who kind of went with the flow and kind of adapt to the changing dynamic between state and business, they were able to survive, kind of wanted to stay. And a lot of those ended up getting squashed.
Would you say that the will of the people in Russia is present and could have a potential impact on legislation? I mean, here in the United States, if people yell and scream loud enough at their town council meeting or whatever, they could get the minimum wage raised or get this pothole fixed or whatever. Do you think that exists in Russia? And if so, to what degree?
Well, definitely, I think I can say with pretty strong confidence that definitely exists to a lesser extent than in the United States. Because I think that, there's far less sense among people close to the crown voted out in the next election compared to your standard U.S. politician. At the same time, though, if things go completely haywire, that you have to ignore that. And I think there's a very interesting case that recently happened. A prominent Russian investigative journalist by the name of Ivan Golunov, he was recently arrested on very suspect drug charges, which were many people looked at that and said, this is a very clear setup. And there's a very strong public backlash to his arrest. All the major Russian newspapers came out against his arrest. Planned protests, and in the end, revoked. So that's not an everyday occurrence, but it does suggest that occasionally it's possible when there's a Russian city called Yekaterinburg, and there was plans to build a church where there was a very popular park for the locals. And so the locals took to massive protests over a span of several weeks, and eventually the Russian authorities retreated on building a church in the park. So these are not life or death issues for the Russian state. So I think they're more willing to show flexibility on them. But I do think that it does suggest that there is sort of some room for the Russian people that when they mobilize, when they make their voices heard, they have some limited potential to make a difference.
Well, for the most part, though, would you say that they're content with their government? I mean, obviously everyone wants better, but would you say they're more happy than the average U.S. citizen is with theirs?
Well, I mean, I would say that when you look at the approval rating, there's clearly a sense that there's if you believe the Levada polling center, which is Russia's foremost independent polling agency. It's frequently quoted in the West. It's widely respected in the West. So this is not some sort of stoogey pro-Kremlin, PR firm. This is a legitimate, polling agency considered very credible in the West. They have Vladimir Putin's approval rating somewhere in the 60s, which is relatively high, but it's far lower than it was even a year ago.
I mean, it's higher than Donald Trump's.
Yeah, it's higher than Donald Trump's, but Vladimir Putin had what many experts call a Crimea bump in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. To the 80s. Now it's kind of there's considerably lower approval ratings for that. So I would say that there are clear signs that I would say that there are some people in Washington who think that a revolution in Russia will happen any day now. I would say that's probably wishful thinking, but I do think it's very fair and accurate to say that certain moves that the Russian government is making is definitely causing some backlash. And we saw last year there were massive protests all across Russia because the Russian government decided to raise the pension age.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to ask one last question because most people listening probably haven't been keeping up with the whole Crimea crisis. That's still not a settled issue, to my knowledge. What's going on with Ukraine, and is there still all-out war?
Well, when it comes to Crimea, Russia claims that it's now part of Russia. Ukraine and the West contest this claim. So, there really is sort of a fundamental disagreement about the status of Crimea. When it comes to the situation in Ukraine, from what I understand, the conflict has died down somewhat. The battles are not as intense as they once were. And it's really interesting to see what the new president of Ukraine is going to be doing. Because as you yourself wrote, an article shortly after, here is a political novice who's literally the closest thing he's had to political experience is playing president on TV. Yeah. He is now the leader of this country, and he's currently in the process of appointing his team, and we're going to see Ukrainian parliamentary elections later this month. And if he's going to be in a position to potentially pursue, a resolution to this conflict. What to expect, but I'm looking on with great interest to see, what happens with Ukraine. I wish I could say with confidence, hey, Alex, this is what's going to happen with Ukraine. But I think we're kind of in an interesting situation right now where doors are being opened, opportunities are emerging, and wait.
So I guess that Dimitri's advice to everyone is keep your eyes on Russia's dealings in the Ukraine and Asia, right? A little bit. I can't quite hear you. No?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you repeat your answer one more time, please?
I would say, as a whole, keep up with my work. I will keep you covered with everything related. I'll keep all of you covered.
All right, there you go. Straight from the guy who said it. Dimitri, I'm so happy that we got to do this. This was incredible. I learned a ton. I'm so excited to hear more of your work. Folks, make sure to follow Dimitri Sims whenever you see him pop up in any of your favorite news publications. Dimitri is a graduate from Johns Hopkins University and is a freelance journalist based in Russia. I'm Alex Badajian. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you again so much for coming on.
Thank you. Have a great day.